Imagine stepping into a royal hall in antiquity. Walls draped in golden tapestries. Marble columns reflecting the glow of hundreds of torches. Tables stretching for dozens of meters. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, rare spices, and strong wines. But do not be fooled. This was never just a feast. This was a political theater, a stage of power where every dish, every cup, every gesture was a calculated message. In the ancient world, royal banquets were not about food or entertainment. They were demonstrations of authority, spectacles designed to show that the monarch was not just a man, but almost a god. Excess was the language of power. While the people starved, kings and emperors turned gluttony into a weapon, proving to all that their wealth was so vast. They could waste mountains of food in a single night. Banquets could gather hundreds or even thousands of guests. Senators, generals, priests, foreign ambassadors. Attendance was not optional. It was a performance of loyalty. To refuse was to risk insult. Or worse, treason. It wasn't just the excess, but the kind of food that mattered. Exotic birds from faraway lands, rare cuts of meat, spices that had crossed deserts and seas. To serve such dishes was to announce, I command not only my people, but the world itself. Roman emperors famously indulged in absurd feasts. Flamingo tongues, live fish displayed for selection, boars stuffed with birds, which themselves contained smaller animals. Egyptian pharaohs did the same, piling mountains of bread and beer, slaughtering herds of cattle to feed the illusion that the ruler was divine abundance incarnate. For many guests, these feasts were not joy but humiliation. Some were served leftovers, watered-down wine, or placed at distant seats, reminding them of their inferior place. Others were forced to drink and eat beyond endurance. Refusal was an insult. Vomit was ignored. Excess was mandatory. What appeared as luxury was often, for the elite, a nightmare in disguise. Gluttony was wrapped in ritual. Eating and drinking until collapse was presented as divine celebration. Kings compared themselves to gods feasting in heaven. Sometimes banquets ended not with desert but with executions. Prisoners brought in to be killed for the amusement of the court. Blending luxury with cruelty in a grotesque theater of power. Waste was deliberate. Entire animals slaughtered only to be discarded, barrels of wine poured onto the floor. In a world of famine, this was psychological warfare. Proof that the king had so much he could afford to destroy what others needed to survive. The hunger of the masses mirrored the excess of the throne. Banquets were also traps. Inviting a rival could mean honor or imminent death. Poison in the wine was not uncommon. Even seating arrangements were strategic. Allies closest to the throne, enemies humiliated at the far ends. Every detail was choreographed to remind everyone who held power. These events could last 4 days, with music, dancing, and performance. But the focus was always on excess. Eating beyond reason, drinking until collapse, applauding the sovereign's whims. It was theater, and the king was the sole star. The irony? The monarch's body often bore the cost. Obesity, disease, sudden deaths. Yet, the practice continued because the banquet was never about health or pleasure. It was about sending the message that power could afford destruction. In the end, these feasts reveal not joy, but fear. There were rituals of intimidation, reminders that kings controlled life and death, abundance and famine. Every plate, every goblet, every act of waste was a declaration. The ruler was not merely a man, he was a god, and his table was the altar of absolute power. If food was a spectacle of abundance in royal banquets, then the goblet was the true instrument of fate. The chalices raised in shimmering halls were not simply symbols of celebration. They were weapons, traps, and tests. In the ancient world, the drink that touched your lips could decide your life. It could be sweet wine from distant vineyards, or it could be a carefully prepared poison. Either way, every sip was political. At the center of these feasts, kings and emperors drank first, raising their goblets high as the crowd roared in approval. But while the toast appeared to be a moment of joy, it was also a moment of terror. Everyone present knew the truth. The goblet was never safe. The practice of poisoning was so common in royal courts that drinking had become a ritual of suspicion. For monarchs, paranoia ruled. Many demanded that every drink be tested before it touched their lips. Servants, slaves, or food tasters were forced to sip wine, wait in silence, and prove survival before the cup was passed to the ruler. But poisoners grew cleverer, developing concoctions that killed slowly, hours, or even days later. Escaping detection, a smile at the banquet could mask a death sentence already sealed. Poisons were not crude. They were crafted with precision, drawn from nature's darkest secrets. Hemlock, aconite, belladonna, arsenic, all were familiar tools of assassins and schemers. The court physician and the poisoner often used the same plants. It was only the dosage that separated healing from death. In some cultures, poisons were refined into almost undetectable powders, dissolved in wine, beer, or water. Others used exotic venoms imported from faraway lands, so rare and strange that no antidote was known. The artistry lay not in killing quickly, but in killing invisibly. The best poison was one that looked like illness, one that left the victim writhing in bed while the conspirator remained beyond suspicion. This is why, in ancient courts, the goblet became a stage for conspiracy. To drink was to gamble. To refuse was to insult. Every feast became a performance of trust and betrayal. But drink was not only feared. It was celebrated, exaggerated, and abused. Kings often used wine and intoxicants as tools of control. Guests were forced to drink beyond their limits, their judgment clouded, their tongues loosened. In the haze of drunkenness, secrets spilled. Loyalties were tested. A single careless word at the banquet could end careers or lives. Some monarchs encouraged chaos, deliberately pushing their guests into delirium. The more disoriented the nobles became, the more powerful the ruler appeared, towering above them, sober in control, while others lost dignity. The banquet hall became a theater of humiliation, staged with alcohol as the central actor. And it was not only wine. Ancient courts experimented with strange concoctions. Mixtures of herbs, hallucinogenic, and exotic substances that blurred the line between ecstasy and madness. Guests were made to drink brews that heightened euphoria, dulled fear, or created visions. Some believed these drinks carried divine power, gifts from the gods themselves. Others suspected they were tools of manipulation, designed to test who was loyal and who was vulnerable. What made the goblet most sinister was how often it was used as a weapon of politics. Emperors and kings both feared and wielded poison. To poison a rival at a feast was not only effective, but symbolic. A reminder that even the cup of celebration could be an instrument of death. In Rome, poisonings became almost routine among the elite. Emperors were known to eliminate enemies silently during banquets, their deaths disguised as illness or overindulgence. In Egypt, political rivals often vanished after drinking wine from the pharaoh's table. In Persia, goblets passed from hand to hand, carried both alliances and betrayals. Even more chilling were the rulers who used poison not in secret but in spectacle. Some emperors were said to deliberately poison condemned prisoners at banquets, forcing other guests to watch them writhe and die, as a grotesque demonstration of power. To drink in such a hall was to be reminded that life and death hung in the ruler's hands. The paranoia this created was suffocating. Guests sighed their goblets with dread. Was the wine too bitter? Did the servant hesitate? Did the king himself smile too coldly as he raised his own drink? Trust collapsed under the weight of fear. Some nobles even carried their own antidotes hidden in rings or pendants, tiny capsules of powdered remedies in case of sudden poisoning. Others refused to drink unless the ruler drank first, creating tense moments of hesitation that could decide reputations. To hesitate too long was to insult the host. To drink too quickly was to risk death. It was a deadly dance, choreographed by suspicion. For rulers themselves, the goblet was both shield and mask. Some emperors cultivated reputations as heavy drinkers, disguising their political calculations behind slurred speech and drunken laughter. But behind the performance, every sip was measured, every reaction calculated. The act of drinking became a disguise, a way to hide cunning intentions under the veil of intoxication. At the same time, rulers often used drink to test loyalty. They would offer a goblet directly to a rival, watching carefully as the man accepted. Refusal was dangerous. Acceptance was deadly. It was a test no one could truly pass, because the outcome always favored the sovereign. The obsession with drink, intoxication, and poison left scars on ancient courts. For the common people, these feasts were symbols of extravagance and corruption. Stories of rulers who drank until madness, of nobles poisoned at banquets, of entire courts collapsing into paranoia, spread like wildfire. The goblet, once a symbol of fellowship, became a symbol of terror, and the legacy persists. Even today, we remember Cleopatra's alleged experiments with poisons, Nero's drunken spectacles, Alexander the Great's mysterious death after a night of drinking. History is haunted by the chalice, because in those ancient halls, the cup was never just a cup. It was a throne in miniature, holding power, paranoia, and death. Imagine the final toast of such a banquet! The torches flickering, the air thick with the smell of wine, the laughter nervous, the goblets raised high. Everyone drinks, but no one drinks without fear. Behind every smile is suspicion. Behind every swallow, the thought, will this be my last? That was the true nature of the goblet in antiquity. It was not a vessel of joy. It was a weapon. A reminder that in the world of kings, every pleasure hid a trap, and every sip could be your final act. Quando pensamos nas festas reais da antiguidade, logo vem à mente mesas abarrotadas de comida e taças transbordando de vinho. Mas havia um lado ainda mais obscuro e perturbador desses eventos: os prazeres proibidos. Momentos de luxúria e decadência que transformavam banquetes em rituais secretos de poder e submissão. O banquete não terminava quando os pratos eram retirados. Pelo contrário, era nesse momento que a festa assumia sua face mais sombria. As cortinas eram fechadas, os músicos trocavam as melodias festivas por sons hipnóticos. E aquilo que antes era um encontro político tornava-se um teatro de excessos carnais. Para reis e imperadores, o sexo não era apenas prazer, era demonstração de poder. Mostrar-se cercado por concubinas, escravos ou cortesãos dispostos a satisfazer seus desejos era exibir ao mundo que seu corpo, assim como seu trono, era servido sem limites. Em Roma, relatos descrevem imperadores organizando orgias que duravam dias, envolvendo dezenas ou até centenas de participantes. Não era apenas libertinagem. Era um espetáculo político. Quem participava provava sua lealdade. Quem se recusava colocava em risco a própria vida. No Oriente, muitos reis utilizavam seus haréns como extensão do banquete. Após a comida e a bebida, convidados selecionados eram conduzidos a aposentos secretos, onde eram obrigados a participar de rituais de prazer comandados pelo soberano. Não se tratava de escolha, mas de submissão. A intimidade tornava-se instrumento de controle. Alguns desses encontros iam além do sexo. Misturavam-se a práticas religiosas ou místicas, criando uma atmosfera de ritual. O prazer carnal era apresentado como uma espécie de comunhão com os deuses, um momento em que os limites humanos eram abolidos. Em certas culturas, sacerdotes eram chamados para abençoar os encontros, legitimando o ato como sagrado. No Egito, por exemplo, havia festas em honra a divindades da fertilidade que terminavam em verdadeiras orgias, vistas como forma de garantir abundância e prosperidade. O limite entre culto e decadência se apagava, e a luxúria tornava-se parte da fé oficial. Em outros casos, rituais secretos envolviam drogas e entorpecentes, usados para intensificar a experiência. Ervas alucinógenas e extratos raros faziam os participantes perderem a noção da realidade, transformando a noite em uma espécie de transe coletivo. O soberano ao centro de tudo era visto como condutor desse delírio, reforçando sua imagem de semideus. Esses encontros também eram marcados pela humilhação planejada. Reis e imperadores frequentemente usavam o sexo como ferramenta de vingança ou castigo. Rivais políticos eram forçados a participar de atos degradantes diante da corte. Mulheres eram expostas, homens eram ridicularizados, e tudo era feito sob o pretexto de prazer. Esse tipo de espetáculo servia para quebrar resistências. O soberano provava que tinha domínio, não apenas sobre os corpos, mas sobre as almas dos presentes. A humilhação pública, travestida de diversão, era um lembrete de que ninguém estava acima da vontade real. Não raro, a luxúria se misturava com violência. Escravos e servas eram usados até exaustão, muitas vezes mortos após os encontros, para que nada pudesse ser revelado fora das paredes do palácio. O prazer de poucos era sustentado pelo sofrimento e pela destruição de muitos. Em algumas cortes, relatos falam de soberanos que obrigavam prisioneiros a participar dessas festas, transformando o ato sexual em parte da punição. Outros utilizavam crianças, vítimas indefesas da perversão travestida de ritual. É uma realidade perturbadora que mostra como a luxúria podia se tornar uma arma de terror. Tudo isso acontecia longe dos olhos do povo comum. Oficialmente, os banquetes eram vistos como símbolos de prosperidade e comunhão. Mas nos bastidores, guardava-se um segredo pesado. Os que participavam dessas orgias raramente falavam, não por vergonha, mas por medo. O silêncio era imposto com ameaças e muitas vezes com sangue. O segredo, porém, escapava em forma de rumores. Histórias de orgias imperiais corriam de boca em boca, pintando reis e imperadores como monstros devassos. Esse imaginário, mesmo que às vezes exagerado, ajudava a construir a aura de mistério e terror que cercava o poder. Afinal, se eles eram capazes de tais excessos em privado, o que não seriam capazes de fazer em público? No fim, os maiores prejudicados dessas práticas eram os próprios soberanos. Muitos morreram jovens, vítimas de doenças venéreas ou da exaustão causada pelos excessos. Outros perderam o respeito da corte, vistos não como deuses, mas como tiranos entregues à loucura. A história registra casos em que banquetes de prazer se transformaram em conspirações. Entre taças de vinho e corpos suados, punhais surgiam, e o soberano caía, traído no próprio altar da luxúria que havia criado. A mesma decadência que servia para consolidar o poder, muitas vezes, também era o estopim da queda. Esses rituais secretos mostram um aspecto sombrio das festas reais. Elas não eram apenas celebrações, mas ferramentas de controle psicológico, político e social. A luxúria, o prazer e a decadência eram utilizados como instrumentos de submissão, humilhação e demonstração de poder absoluto. A mesa, que começava como palco de comida e bebida, terminava como altar de um culto perturbador, onde o corpo humano era reduzido a objeto de manipulação. A verdadeira mensagem por trás desses encontros era clara. O soberano controlava tudo menos até os desejos mais íntimos de seus súditos. When we think of royal feasts in antiquity, our minds immediately conjure images of tables overflowing with food and goblets brimming with wine. But there was an even darker and more disturbing side to these events. The forbidden pleasures. Moments of lust and decadence that turned banquets into secret rituals of power and submission. The banquet did not end when the dishes were cleared away. On the contrary, that was often when the celebration revealed its most sinister face. Curtains were drawn, musicians shifted from festive melodies to hypnotic rhythms, and what had begun as a political gathering transformed into a theater of carnal excess. For kings and emperors, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about domination. To surround oneself with concubines, slaves, or courtiers, willing to fulfill every desire, was to announce to the world that their body, like their throne, was served without limit. In Rome, accounts describe emperors orchestrating orgies that lasted 4 days, involving dozens or even hundreds of participants. These were not mere acts of indulgence, they were political performances. Participation demonstrated loyalty. Refusal could mean disgrace or death. In the East, many rulers used their harems as an extension of the banquet. After food and drink, selected guests were escorted to hidden chambers where they were compelled to take part in rituals of pleasure dictated by the sovereign. This was not choice, but compulsion. Intimacy itself became an instrument of control. Some of these encounters went beyond sex, blending into religious or mystical practices that blurred the line between ritual and debauchery. Carnal indulgence was presented as communion with the gods, a moment when human limits were dissolved. In certain cultures, priests were even summoned to sanctify these acts, giving them a veneer of sacred legitimacy. In Egypt, for instance, festivals dedicated to fertility deities often ended in orgiastic rites, believed to ensure abundance and prosperity. The boundary between worship and decadence collapsed, and lust became state-sanctioned ritual. Elsewhere, rulers employed intoxicants to heighten the experience. Hallucinogenic herbs, rare extracts, and strange concoctions plunged participants into altered states of mind. Nights blurred into trances, where ecstasy, madness, and fear coexisted. At the center of it all stood the ruler, conductor of this delirium, exalted as a... But these encounters were not always about pleasure. They were often about humiliation. Kings and emperors wielded sex as a weapon of vengeance or punishment. Political rivals were forced to participate in degrading acts before the eyes of the court. Women were exposed, men were ridiculed, and every humiliation was cloaked in the language of indulgence. Such spectacles broke resistance. The ruler demonstrated that he held dominion not only over wealth and armies, but over the very dignity of his subjects. Humiliation, staged as amusement, reinforced his absolute authority. Frequently, lust was entangled with cruelty. Slaves and servants were used to exhaustion, often killed afterward to ensure silence. Pleasure for the few was purchased through suffering and death. For the many, some courts forced prisoners into these gatherings, turning sexual exploitation into another form of punishment. In the darkest accounts, even children were drawn into the perverse rituals, victims of a tyranny that cloaked brutality as celebration. These stories remind us that for many, the banquet was not joy, but horror. All of this took place far from the public eye. Officially, royal feasts were symbols of prosperity and unity. Behind closed doors, however, they became dens of secrecy. Those who participated rarely spoke afterward. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Silence was enforced with threats, often with blood. Yet secrets have a way of escaping. Whispers of imperial orgies spread through villages and cities, painting kings and emperors as depraved monsters. Even when exaggerated, these rumors shaped the mystique of power. For the common people, the ruler became a figure of terror, not only because of his armies, but because of the corruption whispered to unfold in the shadows of his palace. Ultimately, rulers themselves often paid the highest price for such excesses. Many died young, ravaged by venereal disease, or weakened by years of excess. Others saw their reputations collapse, remembered not as divine sovereigns, but as tyrants consumed by madness and lust. Banquets of pleasure also became fertile ground for betrayal. Amidst drunken laughter and tangled bodies, conspiracies were born. Knives appeared as suddenly as Some rulers were assassinated in the very chambers where they believed themselves untouchable, undone by the same decadence they had used to assert dominance. These secret rituals reveal the darkest dimension of ancient feasts. They were not simply celebrations, nor mere indulgence. They were carefully staged mechanisms of control, humiliation, and domination. Lust was politicized, pleasure weaponized, and intimacy transformed into submission. The banquet hall, once a stage of food and drink, became an altar of a disturbing cult, one where the human body was reduced to a tool of power. The message was unmistakable. The ruler controlled everything, not just armies, wealth, or laws, but even the most intimate desires of those around him. This was the true face of forbidden pleasures in royal antiquity. Not liberation, but enslavement. Not joy, but fear. Not ecstasy, but the grotesque theater of absolute power disguised as decadence. When we imagined royal banquets and feasts of antiquity, we often think of indulgence, laughter, and endless spectacles of food and drink. But lurking beneath the glittering surface was a truth far more sinister. Death was not merely present at these celebrations. It was part of the entertainment! For kings and emperors, the power to give life and to take it away was the ultimate performance. And so, human suffering became another course in the grotesque theater of absolute rule. Banquets frequently ended not with music or dance, but with the screams of the condemned. Executions staged as after-dinner entertainment were shockingly common in the ancient world. Prisoners were dragged into the hall, paraded before nobles, and slaughtered like animals before the eyes of their rulers. For the monarch, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was political theater. It reminded everyone seated at the table that just as food was consumed, so too could a life be consumed at the ruler's whim. Roman emperors were notorious for this. Accounts describe condemned men being brought to banquets and executed in full view of the guests, sometimes as part of elaborate performances. The body of the victim was treated no differently than the carcass of the animals being roasted in the kitchens. A disposable spectacle to enhance the grandeur of the night. Beyond executions, there were sacrifices, deaths cloaked in religious symbolism. Kings often staged human sacrifices as part of their feasts, offering lives to the gods as proof of their own divine connection. Blood was spilled, not behind closed doors, but in front of courtiers and ambassadors, reinforcing the idea that the ruler commanded not only his people but also the favor of the heavens. In some cultures, slaves or prisoners of war were chosen as sacrificial victims. Their deaths transformed into rituals of abundance and prosperity. Their blood was sometimes smeared on altars, poured into chalices, or even sprinkled across the feast as though it were another seasoning. For the ruler, it was not enough to be host of the banquet. He had to become its high priest, officiating a dark communion where death itself was served. Nowhere was the presence of death more spectacular than in Rome, where gladiatorial combat became synonymous with imperial feasting. While the grand spectacles of the Colosseum are well known, smaller private arenas were often constructed within palace courtyards or gardens, designed to bring the spectacle directly to the ruler's table. Imagine dining on roasted boar and fine wine while men fought to the death just a few meters away. Blood mingled with spilled wine, the cheers of the crowd echoing through marble halls. For the emperor, the spectacle was the ultimate symbol of control. Even the lives of warriors and beasts existed only to add flavor to his meal. Some emperors blurred the line between feasts and massacre entirely. Nero, infamous for his cruelty, reportedly staged nighttime banquets where prisoners were burned alive as human torches, their flames illuminating the gardens while the emperor dined. In such scenes, death was not an interruption of pleasure. It was woven into it. These performances of cruelty were not just for entertainment. They were lessons carefully choreographed for the audience. Guests were forced to watch, knowing that defiance could make them the next victims. To see a man executed for the emperor's amusement was to understand the true fragility of your own position. This was fear weaponized through theater. The banquet hall became a classroom of terror where every noble learned that their lives, no matter how privileged, were as fragile as the prisoners bleeding before them. What made these spectacles even more chilling was the complicity of the audience. Guests were not passive observers. They were participants. They laughed. They applauded. They toasted while men died in front of them. To fail to show enthusiasm was dangerous. Applause became a survival instinct. The line between horror and celebration blurred until death itself was normalized as part of the feast. Some nobles even joined in the cruelty, mocking the dying, making wagers on who would fall first, treating agony as sport. In this way, the banquet not only displayed the ruler's power, but corrupted those around him, binding them together through shared guilt and shared silence. The use of death in royal feasts was more than indulgence. It was symbolic. To spill blood at the banquet was to demonstrate that the ruler controlled every aspect of life. Food nourished, wine intoxicated, and death terrified. Together, they formed the trinity of absolute domination. This also ensured that power was constantly reinforced by fear. Guests left the banquet not only full, but haunted. They carried with them the memory of screams and blood, reminders that loyalty was the only protection against the fire, the blade, or the arena. For those condemned to die, the feasts were nightmares. Slaves, prisoners, political rivals, all could be summoned to entertain their ruler with their suffering. Many of these victims were nameless. erased from history. Their deaths are recorded not as tragedies but as footnotes to a monarch's evening of pleasure. Imagine being one of them. Dragged from a cell, thrown into a hall blazing with light and laughter, forced to die while nobles dined on delicacies. Your death was not only punishment but entertainment, a grotesque joke in which your agony was the punchline. Over time, the presence of death in royal feasts poisoned the moral fabric of entire societies. When elites learned to laugh at executions, when nobles toasted over the blood of prisoners, when sacrifice became synonymous with celebration, cruelty became culture. The very act of feasting, meant to unite people in joy, was transformed into a ritual of fear and domination. This normalization of cruelty outlived the rulers themselves. It became part of the legacy of empires, echoing in stories, legends, and nightmares that persisted long after the fires of the banquets died out. The presence of death at royal banquets carried a message darker than any words. It told the world that life itself was expendable, that the ruler alone decided who lived and who died, and that pleasure could be built upon agony. Every scream silenced by a blade, every body burned for light, every gladiator who bled in the sand was another line in the ruler's declaration of power. And the guests, in their laughter and applause, became part of that message. Picture the final scene of one of these feasts. The tables cleared. The floor still stained with blood. The guests departing in uneasy silence. Behind them lies the memory of laughter mingling with screams, of wine spilled alongside blood, of pleasure intertwined with death. For them, the banquet will never be forgotten. Not for its food or music, but for the reminder that death was always at the king's table. This was the true nature of ancient royal feasts. They were not simply meals or celebrations. They were rituals where abundance was paired with cruelty, where life and death were served on the same table, and where power revealed its most terrifying face. Banquets were meant to display loyalty, unity, and abundance. But in reality, the banquet table was one of the most dangerous places in antiquity. Behind the shimmering gold, the overflowing wine, and the theatrical excess, there lurked whispers of conspiracy, daggers hidden beneath robes, and poisoned goblets waiting to strike. In these halls, trust was a myth, and betrayal was always the main course. Kings and emperors believed their banquets were fortresses of loyalty. After all, the guests were handpicked. Senators, generals, nobles, foreign envoys, people whose loyalty was vital for stability. Yet the very act of gathering so many ambitious men and women under one roof created fertile ground for plots. A toast could mask an oath of betrayal. A laugh could hide a signal. The table was less a place of unity than a chessboard where every gesture was calculated and every word might be a move toward treason. The illusion of safety was often shattered dramatically. Ancient accounts describe rulers collapsing mid-banquet, their goblets slipping from their hands, faces twisted in agony as poison coursed through their veins. Others were cut down at the very table, slain not in battlefields but in the intimacy of their own dining halls. The banquet, meant to glorify the ruler, became the stage for their undoing. Poison was the most infamous tool of betrayal at feasts. Subtle, silent, and nearly impossible to trace in antiquity, poison transformed the banquet into a deadly gamble. Guests never knew whether the next sip of wine would be their last. Conspirators favored poison because of its symbolism. It turned celebration into death, intimacy into treachery. To kill a ruler with a poisoned goblet was to declare that not even his feasts, not even his pleasures, were safe. Some rulers became so paranoid that they employed teams of tasters, forcing servants to drink first. But even this failed to prevent the slow, creeping poisons that could take hours or days to kill. The goblet thus became the deadliest symbol of the banquet. Every toast was a moment of suspicion. Every sip could seal a fate. But poison was not the only weapon. The banquet hall, crowded with music and laughter, also offered perfect cover for assassins. Hidden daggers gleamed beneath robes, waiting for the moment when attention was distracted by song or spectacle. A single cry, a sudden rush of movement, and the feast descended into chaos. Some rulers were cut down in the middle of their own celebrations. Others narrowly escaped, saved only by paranoia that led them to surround themselves with guards even at the dinner table. The lesson was clear. No matter how lavish the feasts, no matter how carefully chosen the guests, death could always sit at the king's table. More chilling still was when the ruler himself used the banquet as a trap. Invitations could be weapons. A noble summoned to dine with the king might arrive expecting honor, but instead find himself accused, arrested, or executed on the spot. In this way, feasts became lures for betrayal. Some monarchs used this strategy to eliminate rivals in one stroke, gathering them under the pretense of hospitality only to slaughter them. The message to survivors was unmistakable. The banquet was not a celebration of loyalty, but a reminder that loyalty could never be trusted. Banquets were not only arenas of domestic intrigue, but also theaters of international deception. Foreign envoys were often invited to feasts as gestures of peace, but these same feasts could conceal traps, poisoned food, deliberate insults, or orchestrated humiliations turned diplomacy into blood sport. In some cases, envoys vanished after royal banquets, their deaths disguised as illness or accidents. The feasts thus became stages for silent wars, where kingdoms clashed not with armies, but with cups of wine and calculated treachery. These betrayals created an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia. Guests eyed one another with suspicion, conversations masked with double meanings, laughter hiding fear. No one could trust the food, the drink, or even the hand offering a toast. Some nobles developed rituals to survive, bringing their own cups, refusing dishes, or eating only after the king. But these strategies offered little protection. To show hesitation could offend. To appear cautious could mark one as a potential traitor. Survival required perfect performance, smiling through the dread that every bite might be poisoned. Plots at banquets were rarely spontaneous. They were rehearsed with signals as subtle as the raising of a hand or the drop of a napkin. A conspirator might scratch his ear, and assassins would strike. Another might raise a cup, and poison would be slipped into a goblet. The hall itself became a web of secrets. Music drowned out whispers, laughter covered nervous glances, and in the chaos of excess, betrayal moved unseen. For conspirators, betrayal at the banquet was often justified as justice. Many saw rulers as tyrants, unworthy of their thrones. To kill a king in the middle of his feast was to expose his decadence, to transform his table of abundance into a grave of corruption. But whatever the justification, the result was always the same: fear. For every ruler slain at a banquet, dozens more doubled their precautions. Banquets grew less joyful, more oppressive. Guards patrolled the halls. Tasters swallowed first. Guests were watched carefully. Celebration became surveillance. The consequences of betrayal were devastating, not only for the conspirators, but for entire families and communities. When a plot was uncovered, punishments were merciless. Suspects were tortured, executed, or stripped of wealth. Sometimes whole lineages were eradicated as a warning to others. The banquet, therefore, carried a paradox. It was both the stage for betrayal and the place where betrayal was punished. It was both the opportunity for conspirators and the trap that destroyed them. Ultimately, the constant threat of betrayal turned the banquet itself into a sinister symbol. It was no longer just a place of food and drink, but a place where trust went to die. Every goblet was a dagger in disguise. Every toast was a gamble with death. The royal feast revealed the darkest truth of power. That absolute authority breeds absolute suspicion. Rulers could never relax, nobles could never trust, and every celebration was haunted by the specter of betrayal. Picture the banquet hall. The tables gleaming with gold, the air heavy with music and laughter. Guests raise their cups, but their eyes flick nervously toward one another. Somewhere, a hand trembles, a servant hesitates, a ruler smiles too broadly. And in that moment, no one knows if the next breath will come with laughter or with death. That was the reality of betrayal at the royal table. Behind every toast, there was treachery. Behind every feast, there was fear. And behind the glitter of abundance, there was always the shadow of the dagger. The fires of the banquet halls have long since gone cold. The music has faded, the laughter silenced, the goblets emptied. Yet the memory of ancient royal feasts lingers, not as a celebration of prosperity, but as a haunting reminder of how power can corrupt every human ritual, twisting joy into cruelty, abundance into fear, and communion into domination. To conclude this story, we must confront the legacy left behind. A legacy that reveals not only the excess of kings, but the fragility of humanity itself. Banquets were never simply about food, drink, or celebration. They were mirrors, reflecting the nature of those who held power. A generous king could turn the feast into a symbol of unity, a way of binding his people together. But most often, rulers used the table as a throne, transforming every dish and every toast into a declaration of supremacy. In antiquity, abundance itself was weaponized. To waste food while the people starved was to remind them of their place. To drink without fear of poison was to show invulnerability. To turn intimacy into humiliation or entertainment into death was to prove that the ruler's authority extended beyond politics or law. It reached into the very flesh and soul of those who served him. And so the banquet, meant to be a gathering of joy, became a grotesque theater of power. Its legacy is not one of happiness, but one of fear, spectacle, and submission. History is filled with tales of rulers who indulged too much in their own feasts. Their bodies swelled with gluttony, their minds clouded by intoxication, their reputations shattered by rumors of decadence. The same banquets that once glorified them often accelerated their downfall. Rome's emperors became infamous for their obscene feasts, symbols not of strength, but of corruption. Pharaohs, surrounded by pyramids of food and oceans of drink, became isolated from the very people they ruled. Kings of the East, hidden behind harems and rituals of pleasure, were remembered not as gods, but as tyrants. In the end, the feast revealed a paradox. What was meant to showcase immortality instead exposed mortality. Bodies weakened, reputations crumbled, dynasties fell. The excesses of the table mirrored the excesses of the throne, and both proved unsustainable. Behind every royal feast lay countless invisible victims. The slaves who prepared the meals, the prisoners forced into humiliating rituals. The innocents who bled in the sand of private arenas, the servants who swallowed poison so their masters could drink safely. Their names are lost to history, erased beneath the grandeur of palaces and monuments. But their suffering is part of the banquet's legacy. Each goblet raised in celebration carried the weight of human misery. Each course served was paid for in sweat, blood, or fear. And though the rulers may have believed they were dining as gods, the truth is that they feasted on the very lives of those beneath them. Perhaps the darkest legacy of these feasts is how they normalized cruelty. To laugh while a man was executed. To toast while prisoners burned as human torches. To applaud while nobles were humiliated. These acts desensitized entire societies. When death becomes entertainment and humiliation becomes ritual, humanity itself corrupts. The banquet halls train not just kings, but courtiers, nobles, and guests to see cruelty as spectacle. This erosion of empathy did not stay contained within the palace. It spread into society, shaping cultures that equated obedience with survival and silence with wisdom. The echoes of this normalization can still be heard in later ages, in courts that demanded displays of loyalty. Through fear, in spectacles of punishment carried out in public squares in every instance, where power dressed brutality in the costume of tradition, even centuries later. The image of these feasts lingers in our imagination. We remember not the taste of the food, not the sound of the music, but the shadows, poisoned goblets, orgiastic rituals, blood spilled for entertainment, betrayals whispered over golden tables. Legends exaggerate, but they exaggerate because the truth was already grotesque. Ancient historians wrote not to celebrate the feasts, but to warn of their horrors. And in their warnings, we see a reflection of our own fears. That power, unchecked, always turns rituals of unity into theaters of domination. The true legacy of these feasts is not found in recipes or traditions. It is found in the warnings they left behind. They remind us how fragile joy becomes when twisted by tyranny. They show how abundance can be turned into oppression, how trust can dissolve into suspicion, how community can be replaced by cruelty, They also remind us that power seeks not only to command armies or pass laws, but to dominate the most basic human experiences. Drinking, loving, celebrating. When a ruler controls these, he does not just rule bodies, he rules souls. Imagine, then, the closing image of history's darkest feasts. The banquet hall empty, the torches extinguished, the tables silent. The laughter has turned to whispers, the wine to poison, the food to ash. The ruler, once adored as a god, lies in a tomb, his body decayed by the very excess he celebrated. The guests, once complicit, vanish into silence, their fear swallowed by time. What remains is the lesson that the grandeur of the feast was always an illusion. Beneath the gold and music, it was built on fear, betrayal, and blood. And so, the dark legacy of royal feasts endures. Not as tales of prosperity, but as warnings carved into the collective memory of humanity. Warnings that power, when left unchecked, will consume even its own celebrations, turning joy into terror and abundance into ruin. The story of ancient royal feasts is not just history. It is a mirror held up to every age, a reminder that the dangers of excess, paranoia, and cruelty are never far away. Even today, when we raise a glass in celebration, somewhere in the back of our minds lingers the echo of poisoned goblets. Humiliated guests and rulers who mistook domination for divinity. That is the haunting truth. The banquet, symbol of unity, became instead the altar of fear. And its legacy, like the shadows of the torches that once lit those marble halls, stretches endlessly across time. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.